Hello everyone, to Cardinal Directions, the show where four dudes band together to talk about the craft of being a dungeon master, share their successes and their failures, and hopefully learn together with you what they can do to improve. Additionally, we just like talking. This episode is the second of the series. During the podcast, we'll be executing a concept called two wrongs and two rights. Two of us will present examples of good DMing, while the remaining two will present examples of not so good DMing. After that, we'll talk over what we did well and how we can avoid repeating our mistakes. So get yourself a snack, get yourself a drink, and without further ado, welcome to Cardinal Directions, guiding you on your journey to becoming a better DM.
And that's a perfect intro from Nick. Thank you, Nick. So this is the second episode of Cardinal Directions. Thank you all for being here again. And we'll welcome you. I'm Axel, Dungeon Master. And to my right at the moment is Pat.
Hello, I'm Pat, and I'm also Dungeon Master. Played for about DM for about 2 years, played for about 4 years, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm Nick. You heard my voice in the intro. And I have a Roll20 account since Christmas 2018, and I've spent 556 hours on that website so far, and I'm also a Dungeon Master.
Hello guys, I'm Pavel. I've been DMing for 4 years, most of them in real life, then moved last year because of Corona to Roll20. I've also been a player in different campaigns and like to DM homebrew and modules alike.
Very well. Thanks everyone for your introductions. Today we have two topics to discuss that go one with another. The first one is going to be Session 0, and the second one is going to be how to start a campaign. So, we have a few things to talk about here. Who would like to start us on Session 0? We want to talk about lines and veils, two important concepts. I think, Nick, you coined the terms here, so I'll let you start with this.
Oh, I wish I was the one who coined the term. This is actually from Sly Flourish. At least that's why I heard it first. I'm sure many DMs are familiar with the concept, where lines are the lines you do not cross in your campaign. Veils are the fade to black scenes that you do in your campaign. And safe words are obviously safe words. They're probably more familiar to our viewers in a different context. That your players can use to say that they don't feel comfortable in a situation. They'd rather want to stop or step away from the table for a minute to compose them.
And why is it so important to talk about these things in Session 0? Maybe we should start by introducing the concept of a Session 0. Pat, can you describe to us what the concept of a Session 0 is?
Right. So, obviously, Session 0 is when the DM and the players gather around to talk about what kind of game they want to play in the first place. I think Session 0 is the time to create characters, manage expectations, set boundaries, like with veils and lines, and in general just get a feel for what the whole long endeavor. Usually the campaign takes months, if not years, to complete, so it's important to set it up properly.
Indeed. And that's a time people can take before the campaign to align all of these things and make sure that you don't end up on Reddit on RPG horror stories after having a campaign that wasn't well defined at the beginning.
So Nick, if that is your way to claim fame, sure, why not? I always wanted to be in a green text, gotta be honest.
Yeah, we all have different goals regarding that.
The highest honor.
So you wanted to talk about lines and veils first. So why should we talk about lines and veils? You said lines are things that we don't want to cross during the game.
Exactly.
Why is that so important?
Well, they're safety tools, really. So if you think about it, D&D is a game where you're pretty vulnerable, I'd say, as a person. You play a character, you're acting in a character, and I think that's already something that takes a lot of people out of their comfort zone. to play someone else, to do silly voices, and not that's not for everyone, but like we've all seen players do that. And I think having concepts in the game that you're all on the same page that you do not want to cross with the lines, for example, violence towards children or unwanted sexual contact, stuff like that can be very harmful to the psyche. It's important to talk about this before you start the game, to see where you all stand, what's okay and what's not okay, because ultimately we're all just here to have fun.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I totally agree. I think D&D should be a safe space, and that's why it's important to have this at your table. So we talked about lines which are kind of the absolute version of do not cross this line or something is going wrong.
Yes.
Veils, on the other hand, they're more of a nuanced thing. For example, you might not be willing to have sexual content in your campaign. However, you might be fine if it's just a fade to black type scenario where some PCs and some NPCs might have romance going on in the background, but it is not something that is presented directly. It is something that's presented through narration. For example, if two PCs have this kind of relationship, you might have them maybe go into the woods by themselves for a bit of a romantic trip, but you won't necessarily describe that. That allows you to have flexibility where people can do what they want to do and experience the game as they want to without harming others and influencing their experience. There was a last concept that we talked about was safe words.
Yes. So whenever a topic comes up that you haven't discussed prior with the lines or veils, I think it's important to have a phrase or a safe word for your players that they can utter when you come onto a concept that you haven't discussed, but where people don't feel comfortable having that at the table. And I think it's better to have a safe word than just outright saying, hey guys, I'm not comfortable with this. I mean, you can totally do that. It's a valid form of communication. But I think a safe word makes it so that no one feels stepped on their toes if a player does not feel comfortable with what's happening at the table. Because the table, what happens at the table is usually a result of the player actions and the DM actions, and not being comfortable where the game takes you could also be perceived as a slight against the way a player or a DM plays this game, even though that's totally not intended. So using a safe word is more social, kind of softens the blow, if you will.
Mm-hmm. And as we know, D&D is, as you said before, it's a game with a lot of personal touch to it. And so I think it's important as people get involved in most things in life, you have a tendency to, get attached to what's happening and maybe just interpret things the wrong way. So all of these three tips that we talked about, these three concepts, are all about communication. And that's what most of the Session Zero stuff is going to be about, communication and making sure everyone is on the same page. And on that note, we wanted to talk about expectations and desires, what people want from the campaign. Pavel, can you maybe explain to us a bit more how you yourself in your campaigns have dealt with managing expectations and making sure that everyone is on the same page?
So the first expectation that they need to decide on is if the campaign is open-ended, sandboxy, they can go wherever they want, or is more railroady with a heavy narrative that they must follow to get the best out of their session. That depends on the DM also and what he's willing to provide. Another expectation is if your character is mortal or not. Like if you expected a hard campaign or an easy campaign. Also expectations from the players, how heavy into RP and heavy into combat the campaign might be, and what focus the campaign will follow. If it's gonna be a dungeon crawl, hack and slash, get the loot with some fancy jokes in between, or it's gonna be a political intrigue campaign where they need to partake in diplomatic missions for different factions and mediate. Or a combination in between. Yeah, that's what I would expect.
And so what's so, important about setting up these expectations, and what the kind of the goal of it, at the back of all of this?
So, to avoid the situation where a player is expecting maybe combat at every session, and like it's not the focus of the campaign, so he doesn't get what he wants, then he can say in session 0, guys, this is not the type of session I was expecting, so I'm just gonna leave. I think it's important to know what you're getting into.
Because D&D is a commitment. It's time you spend with other people. Generally, it's pretty time consuming, at least for most people who, are pretty busy with their adult lives, or even if you're in school or in college. Dedicating 2 to 4 hours a week to something is already a commitment. And especially because, often in terms of scheduling, it's always the same day and people are expecting you to be there. So in a way, it's both, a duty to be there, and at the same time, something you have to keep in mind for yourself and what you're planning. So it's important to know that you're at the right table and the game is gonna, be what you want it to be, in a way. And that's fine if it's not. It just means you have to maybe go and find another table. And there are plenty of different styles to pick from. There are tools to find people, and if someone's watching and didn't know that, there are subreddits that you can go on. There's a famous subreddit called LFG where you can find players for that if you are looking to find new groups. So it's just important to make sure you're at the right table so that everybody gets the experience of play they want.
Well, to be fair, LFG right now is pretty crowded, and it's gonna be hard to find a spot as a player. So I would suggest that if you're looking for a game, just mass apply and see what games you get, and if the game seems likable, just play it. As a DM, you can tailor the game whatever you want to DM, and you're probably gonna get 15 applications. So
yeah, just become a DM yourself, play the long game, and make one of your players interested in DMing and become a player in his campaign. Axel, that's always a good idea.
Indeed.
Well, it's important to remember that everyone's supposed to have fun at the table. So that's why I have these tools like consensual, sort of the topics we want to talk about, we want to avoid, and the type of games we want. Everyone's supposed to have fun. They're supposed to make a character that they enjoy. And maybe that's not very easy sometimes, especially if someone's starting out. But when we're dealing with strangers, we should be at least respectful enough, like in real life. When we meet someone, we don't immediately talk about stuff that might upset someone. And in the case where we are basically role playing a virtual sort of self where different things can happen, we have to talk about what we don't want to happen, right? What we don't want maybe like traumatic scenes of torture in our Sunday afternoon campaign.
Totally.
When we're just trying to relax. So yeah.
I mean that I in general I kinda, I mean, if they're complete strangers, obviously, but after a bit of knowing your players, like a session 0 from a group of friends is way different than a session 0 from a complete strangers, and boundaries need to be way clearer for strangers.
I totally agree, but if this is just someone you know casually as well, and you know them from a certain environment where things like graphic violence doesn't come up in conversations, it might in fighting like magic adventure, right? So these things are important to mention.
I personally would categorize this and like putting in front of your players things that are not interesting for them, and I would say it's more in bad DMing in general. Like they could also make a boring encounter instead.
That as well.
So
Because
maybe
it's
maybe
also...
yeah,
Apologies,
sorry.
go ahead.
Maybe the players are okay with violence, but the way the DM presented is just mindless and without any focus.
Because it's also important to have the type of campaign you're looking for. If you're looking for, a campaign where you just want to have fun and do some silly things, enjoy D&D at its most comical, you might not be interested in a super serious, Curse of Strahd campaign, for example. The theming is important for that, but also for your characters. And as we're talking about Session 0, I think it would be important to talk about character creation. If they're, making characters as a part of Session 0. I'll open up a bit about my own experience here. I have been DMing in multiple campaigns. I have, at this point, closed one campaign that's been lasting for a couple of years. I have 2 others ongoing. And one of the first lessons I learned from my first campaign is, first of all, you need a Session 0, which I didn't notice at the time, but, when you're starting into D&D, you don't have that habit of communicating so much. And also, the characters were made independently, and that was probably my biggest mistake of the campaign, because that meant that they all had different goals, different personalities that wouldn't necessarily align, and then it was my job to make sure to give them hooks that would interest all of them. And while at the same time it is also, a player's job, a topic we'll talk about maybe in a later episode, it is important for you as a DM, and it makes your life so much easier if you make the characters somewhat together, at least if they have some ties. So we want to discuss about multiple ways of doing this link between the players. And maybe we'll talk about it a bit more in how to start the adventure campaign. But do you guys have any basic stuff that you want to be made together, or basic information that you want to know about the characters in Session 0 or talk about with the players? Nick, for example, do you have any particular thing in mind?
Well, it really depends on the campaign setting you're running, I think. In general, you can say if there's an overarching plot device, having a similar goal or a similar background usually works well for players. The thing is, curating characters together, when we say align, it's important to say that we don't need players to play the same character. There need to be differences in personality, because those are what make the game fun. When you have role-playing opportunities, how different characters react. But knowing that you are playing together is very important. And that is, in my mind, what the character creation in Session 0 is for. Not necessarily having the same goals or the same background, but knowing I'm here to play with the other players, and I can play the lone wolf rogue, but I'm the lone wolf rogue for the party.
I think that's a very good precedent to set. It's expectations in a way that is just at a macro level, basically, for your character. You don't know what your character's idea is, but you know that it's gotta work with the party, it's gotta fit into this kind of theming of the world, and from then on you can start making your character with a more, with more information. We'll talk about that a tiny bit more in the next session. But one of the things we also wanted to talk about for Session 0 is going to be the biggest, baddest, evil guy in D&D, which is scheduling. It's known, and most people who have played D&D will tell you that's the reason most campaigns end, is because scheduling can't be, doesn't work for them. People are available at different times, and you can't quite get a session together. And I've had, my fair share of problems like this as well. So, what can you do to make sure that your campaign can work in terms of just people being there? Pat, do you have any examples of your own experience?
Yeah, I mean, my campaigns were always set on a single day at a single hour, unless we decide to, not play because, let's say, 2 people are busy on that point. So, and I was actually working a lot at the time, so it was often me who couldn't make it because my work schedule was very messy. But still, we managed to play on average, at least 2 sessions per month. I think it just depends of the type of people you're playing with. Some people will always be busy. Some people will not have a regular schedule or won't have time. And if you really want to play that session every month, well, you just can't accommodate that, unfortunately. That kind of players need to find a session that's more flexible. One thing I think is something you shouldn't do is, unless you're, I don't know, all billionaires with lots of free time and nothing to do but play D&D, is don't have sessions on a whim or on a random day for 8 hours, like whenever like you see, oh, everyone's available this day, because that can lead to DM burnout. I was in a campaign where we were all very excited to play, and we basically, that was a long time ago, but we were pressured our DM into running the games, and he had nothing prepared, because why would he? And the games weren't very good, and the DM was not interested in playing the game after a while, just because he didn't feel like his ideas were good anymore. So it's better to have a set schedule, both for, well, first of all for DM so you can prepare properly, and for everyone to always expect when it's gonna be. It also saves some like misunderstandings if it's always the same time. Usually people have like a weekly schedule they adhere to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I usually ask the players to tell me what free time they have, and in Excel just see if there is a line that every player can be on time at specific hour. Usually there is, and we pick that date and time for the session. And I also make like you need to establish again rules like, okay, if you have an emergency, you cannot show up, you have fever, your dog just died, that's fine, you miss the session. But what if your boyfriend asks you to go skiing on that day? And then you say, hey guys, I'm going skiing with my boyfriend. Is that okay or not? And that's, for example, in my session, if somebody says to me that, I'm out of it, get out, no.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that also needs to be discussed.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Pavel, with the boyfriend going skiing thing, because I totally agree with you, and my reason for this is following, and this probably comes up in online play more than it does come up in offline play, but there's at least in my mind some form of cognitive dissonance going on with online play and prioritizing scheduling. So I've been engaging in various hobbies online, not just D&D, but also playing Counter-Strike or other games with friends online. And you often hear, well, you're playing online, that's not a real thing. You can just step away from that, and if it's not happening in real life, it's not happening at all. But I feel like if you commit to a time slot, you should prioritize that just as you would a real life event. If you say, well, Fridays I'm going out with friends to have a drink, and your boyfriend would ask you, do you want to go skiing on Friday? You would be like, well, I already made plans on Friday, my friends, so I can't. But suddenly it's just online D&D, and somehow it's okay to ditch that. And I feel like just because it's online doesn't make it less real. It's still a time commitment that you agree to, and you should prioritize that just as you would a outside world event.
Mm-hmm. And I can totally get that, because as a DM, that's one of the things that affects you the most. Because generally, as a player, you're there, but it doesn't affect you as much if another player is missing. As a DM, you might have a story beat planned for that person. You might have, NPCs that you have tailored to be able to interact with that PC. Maybe you have some character advancement that you wanted to happen this session. Or maybe they're just important to the combat that's at hand, and not having that player makes life a lot harder for you. And then I think that's when we go back to what Pavel was saying earlier about being, for lack of a better term, being ready to boot people. I'll say it like this, because it's important as a DM to know your boundaries, to know where, what is stepping on your toes, and to know the commitment you're able to make. And you can wait for players that don't come, that are flaky, that, always come in super late or stuff like that. But it's gonna make your life harder, and eventually, at least in my experience, you're gonna burn out of that group or that campaign because you don't get to experience what you're trying to make. You spend hours prepping, you spend hours making sure everything is nice, and then if it doesn't happen frequently and it's just someone just not showing up time after time, it's a lack of respect for you, and it's a lack of respect for the others, because then everything that would have happened there can't. Pat, you want to say something?
Well, yeah, as you just finished, I realized, it also scales. Like, depending on if you're doing, it's like a casual game and you're doing a little prep, it's not quite as bad, right? But if you're really involved in your campaign, then it's really bad if someone just, especially if you're in a situation where one person doesn't show up, so you're not playing, because maybe that character is important, or maybe you have a few players, or maybe just that kind of ethic at the table where we're not playing if not everyone's here. Well, that sucks, doesn't it? So it is disrespect to your time, everyone else's time, and your work. And DM usually has a lot of stuff to do, not only preparing the game but organizing things. So
yeah. And I think in the same vein, though, you should always, like Axel, you actually mentioned this briefly, with being in a point in a campaign where you're playing out a vital part of one character's story, and if that character's missing, there's nothing you can. That just sucks.
Yeah.
But I think if you're not at that stage in your campaign, as a DM, it's very important to enforce boundaries like that. Just say, well, if you're missing, we'd love to have you at our table next time when you're back, but we're not going to stop the session.
Yeah.
That is, if you have enough players at the table. If you're a 3-man team and one player is missing, then yeah, maybe you can think about it, because they're always vital. But if you're a 5-party group and one player is missing, I don't think there's any harm in going ahead with the session anyway.
Yes, I agree. And that's also one of the points we should discuss as parts of Session 0 with your players, to talk about when do we play the game? If someone is missing, do we play the game? If 2 people are missing, do we play the game? How much is the minimum number of players you want to have? And I will tell you, as a DM, in my experience, making sure that you have a set number, and you're like, if we have 3 people we're playing, is going to make your life so much better. Because then you don't have to worry about actually managing it on the day, unless like a lot of people are suddenly absent. You're going to be fine, you're going to be playing, you're going to, go ahead with the plan you had. And even though, you might be missing some players that are, might be important to the story, at least you have this feeling of, I can still play D&D, Because there's no worse feeling than prepping the whole week. It's time for the session. Someone's not there. You have to cancel, wait for next week. And then you're not even sure if next week everybody's going to be there. So, all in all, important to talk about your boundaries and how much commitment you want to have in the campaign. Alright, I think that's a pretty good take on the subject. There's another last subject we want to talk about for Session 0, which is going to be house rules.
Oh, yes.
Oh yeah, Pavel, can you talk to us about why it's important to talk about house rules before the campaign starts?
House rules can majorly change your campaign depending on them. For example, in the second to last campaign I'm DMing now, I made a house rule that short rests last a day, like it's a normal long rest, and the long rest lasts a month. And in my world, the month is 24 days. So that majorly changes the way my players approach the world and the downtime activities. And some players may be like, hey, why are you randomly nerfing my class? Now I can cast Disintegrate only once a month instead of once a day. So it's important to tell them beforehand so they can plan around it, think about it, maybe buff some utility spells that are made, for example, Mordekaiser's Mansion, I think was called a spell, that now I buffed it to last a month instead of just a day, because they're consuming the spell slot. That's one house rule. And yeah, just generally house. Some players like expect you to house rule the crits, which I don't do. Some players expect flanking rules, and yeah, other house rules that, and maybe on some tables, like there were rules that are not official, and they're surprised when they come to a different table and they expect different things. For example, I'm not sure how I could have evaded this, but there was a player that I had on a one shot from a Facebook group that at his previous table they did persuasion checks on players, and if they rolled high enough, they technically convinced them anything.
Mm-hmm.
And that obviously not official roll. And he came to my table and he was very offended and surprised when at my table, if he rolls a high persuasion check, he cannot just convince the other players of anything. Yeah. So in general, it's important to put forth the house rules at the beginning so players can build their characters around it and have fun with them or without them. Maybe they absolutely hate the house rule and don't want it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's important to talk about it before the campaign so that if there's any issue, you can discuss it before it happens, which makes it a lot easier for communication. And also it helps players expect what's going to be in the campaign, and maybe there's some theming. Maybe you have a campaign where you have a lot of house rules to make characters feel more powerful. Like healing potions as a bonus action, maybe other rules of this kind, or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you have a super harsh campaign. It's important to discuss this before the sessions happen. And overall, I think that closes the subject pretty well of session 0. I'll summarize real quick the points we talked about. We talked about, in general, setting expectations and a precedent for communication. Make sure that everyone knows they can communicate, and also talks about what they want to see, what they don't want to see, the lines and veils that we talked about. Make sure that there is a safe word to stop any interaction that feels uncomfortable, or at least, pause the game for just a moment so that that person can at least feel, keep feeling good and feel safe in the game. Talk about the style of campaign, the theming, the balance of the different pillars, combat, exploration, role-playing, and finally talk about scheduling. So make sure that everybody's on the same page and the game is going to be able to be run. And I think this gives a good foundation to, from that point on, make a session 1 that is successful. And so now let's talk about how to make a successful session 1, how to introduce your characters to the world. There are many ways that have been tried and true. We'll talk about a few of the classic ones. So Nick, why don't you talk to us about starting in a tavern? Because that's a really important topic. Yeah.
Yes, it is. It is probably the most important topic, because starting in a tavern is the start to your
iconic
D&D
start.
campaign.
Yes.
It is the iconic start. Everyone has been in a tavern before, which is actually why it's so popular. Everyone knows what a tavern is like. And starting in a tavern is great. It's definitely better than starting in a cart with a horse thief and 2 rebellious stormcloaks. I think what makes the tavern start so popular is that it's actually a way to bring your party together without them having any backstory at all. They're sitting in a tavern, they can immediately start exploring the world. There are patrons there, they can pick up gossip and rumors. There are usually bartenders there who know a lot of stuff that you can hand them out quests for. And also, tavern is a great place to roleplay and get to know each other.
Mm-hmm.
It also makes sense, like a place where people who the characters are supposed to be would meet, right? It's iconic. But I think it works better with more advanced players who already know what they want to do. Because if you have someone completely new, they need a stimulus to do something. Usually there needs to be some crisis, there needs to be some issue that has to be attended to. If you just put them in a tavern and they're now supposed to be this different character for the first time, it can be quite daunting.
I think that's a very good point. There's an advantage to starting in tavern because you have this chill environment. There's no pressure. You have a bit of time. You can role play, but at the same time, that can also be high pressure for newer players that aren't necessarily super familiar with the concepts of role playing and acting in character in the tavern. I think one of the disadvantages is that there is no guidance, at least until you as a DM provide some. But I have seen, stories about DM starting in a tavern and just not having any, as Nick said, stimulus, not having anything that pushes the player to do something. And then, the first session being extremely boring because of it, because the players don't know what to do and they have no guidance. So I think that's important to keep in mind that if you start in a tavern, you have freedom, but you gotta have a way to either guide your players or have experienced players. Otherwise, it might end up just being a very passive kind of session.
Indeed, especially in online play, which is what I'm more familiar with. It's pretty much a guaranteed disaster if you drop random players that you've met online in a tavern and expect them to get along. It's 30 minutes of awkwardness and silence and people stumbling along and trying to find their words to not...
Well, the problem is if you have more than 4 characters, then like 4 corners of the tavern are already taken by mysterious clothed figures. And the 5th guy doesn't have anywhere to sit.
Indeed.
Yes. Well,
no more room for edgy rogues.
Yeah. Easy way to fix that is you're DDM, you're God in that world.
Yeah, pentagonal tavern. Easy.
Yes. Have it be a tavern that walks, or make it more easy. Have them interact with an NPC. Give them a waitress or a waiter to talk to really quick.
Mm-hmm.
Have someone stumble in from the outside who's drenched in blood and says he was attacked by bandits. Make something happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Have a trigger, yes. Have something that prompts the player to action. And as that goes back to the fundamentals of being a DM, you are here to be the world and to be the events that happen. You are here to cause things to happen. In the first session, what better, way to start the campaign than doing your job as a DM and making sure that something happens. Either it's the barmaid coming and, talking to the PCs, or it's, a bloody guard approaching from the outside, or maybe the tavern just gets, burned by a dragon. Just something that happens that puts the events in motion.
And actually, this is one of my favorite variations of the tavern start, is the morning after. You don't actually start in the tavern.
Mm-hmm.
The tavern thing already happened, but you don't remember. And that's a fun start, because that immediately makes your players move into action. Find out, what did they do last night? Should they apologize to anyone? And what damages do they have to pay to the mayor of the town?
Indeed. Yeah, putting players in a tough scenario to start with is another surefire way of bringing in tension from the beginning. And I think this is one to talk about, actually. Similar to the captured beginning, where you wake up in a cart, you've been captured because you tried to pass the frontier. That, is not a reference to anything. There is the, fuck, I did something bad and now I must fix it. Beginning. And I think one of the things that is very good and that it addresses is the problem of the tavern, that there's no stimulus. In this, if you start by being captured, or you start in the office of the mayor that's talking to you about why did you lit on fire half the bazaar, you have to explain yourselves. You have to find a reason for things to be like this, and that's already stimulus. Where you have to escape, or you are forced into a situation where you have to act. And I think that's very good for new players, for example, as long as they have some guidance, at least, because it just prompts them to action right away and they know what they're supposed to do.
Yeah. And Pat and Pavel, I don't know what you think about this, but my goal as a DM, because as a player I feel that way as well, is why is the party together? That is I want to provide the reason why the party is together with my opening scene. And I think the tavern start lends itself to that very well. If you already have in session 0 discussed why the player characters might know each other, and there's a reason why they're together. What do you guys think about that? What's your way to give a reason for it?
Well, I think it's in recent times at least. I did do the Tavern Start once, and it went okay, but it wasn't very exciting, and it took a while for the PCs to decide which quest they want to go on. And so lately I've tried to do something different. So have the characters already with some pre-assigned simple quest, escort merchant through the forest, whatever. And there is an encounter. In this example, it was pretty simple. They were attacked by some mysterious creatures. So that way, they already knew each other because they were on days on the road. So of course, players didn't know each other's characters, but it was already implied that they are like very loosely affiliated by the same goal. There's already something to do right off the bat, and I think it lent itself better to the first session when they actually got to town after the encounter. They went to the inn and they talked in the inn about stuff. Like they just RP'd afterwards because the characters already knew a little bit about each other. Some player helped another player in combat. There was some sort of bond already happening, and there wasn't an hour of lore preamble introducing the town at the beginning of the game. It was just fun.
I think asking in session 0 if players want to conjoin their backstories could also be a good way to make them work together towards the same goal no matter what. Either maybe they have family ties, or they work for the same faction, or they work towards improving the same city, or maybe they're against the same organizations in general that wronged them in their backstories in different way. Maybe there's an evil cultist group that both burned the forest and destroyed the church, so both the cleric and the druid now are working together to deal with them. And in different ways you can naturally make the players work together. I also think that the simplest thing for a DM is before the session starts, you would try to convince your players that working together is a good thing. Maybe that's not too hard to do. And after that, you would ask them themselves, why would your character work together? Or how can you make your characters work together? And usually the answers that they give is most of the time better and more in character than what you would try to force as a DM to them.
That's a very good tip, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just
I
want
like
to
that
add to
a
that.
lot.
You can add a in-game in-lore, very simple in-lore explanation why even the party of adventurers exists. It's because the world is dangerous. People don't travel by themselves. People don't do endeavors by themselves. You have to have some backup. So it makes sense even for a loner rogue to be like, well, yeah, I want some meatheads to check the bush first.
And if you want to play an antisocial character, unfortunately, you will kind of need to metagame in order to play it. You will probably need to say, okay, if I'm a rogue, I'm not gonna ever steal from the party, even if it doesn't make necessarily sense. And I'm not gonna obviously ever kill a party member. And if you're an evil character, it's the same. You'll try to keep your evilness hidden as much as possible just to achieve your goals, and that goes preferably not opposite to the party's goals, maybe just on the same direction. So yeah, if you want to play a peculiar evil or chaotic character, then you need to metagame it to not antagonize the party in any way, so in order for everybody to enjoy the session.
Yeah, you're always evil for the party, and you're always stealing for the party, even though you're a loner. I think that's very important to keep in mind if you play a lone character like that.
Yeah, also... Sorry,
otherwise it's not fun, and you're just gonna get killed or kicked from the party.
Yeah.
And that's something you gotta talk about also, like during session 0, because it's not something that's necessarily super easy to think about if you're a new player. The concept of I as a player need to find a way for my character to go with the party. It doesn't matter what I think I want my backstory to be. If the character doesn't go with the party, you can't play the character. At least that's how it is in my campaigns. Because you gotta find a way to adventure. You see many stories of people making characters that just want some money and then retire, and then you can ask yourself, why would that character even go adventuring and not be a merchant for a bit and then just retire? For adventuring to tell the stories that people want to tell through D&D, which is mainly like a fantasy kind of superhero style of game. You need to have someone who's ready to risk their lives to protect others and maybe to bond with other people. And the loner rogue might be a bit difficult to do. You have good examples though in media. You can play someone like Han Solo, a character that is supposedly like a bad guy, or at least a neutral guy, but then he works with the party. He works with the other characters in the story to make things happen. Or if you want to look at another D&D example, you have Not from Critical Role, which is, she's a rogue. At first, her and another character, Caleb the Wizard, are separated from the main group of the party by their own reasons, but they make sure, and you can see it all over the show, that the players make sure that the characters have reasons to stay together. And that's your responsibility as a player.
Yeah. For the record, Greedo shot first, not Han Solo. But I wanted to touch up on a point that, Pat, you mentioned with the merchant start. I really like that idea as well, and I've heard that term before being called patron start, where the party is confronted with a patron that sponsors their adventure. So they immediately start with a quest that brings them together. And I think that's a good start. I like that one a lot.
Well, I went over the fact that they're already employed. I actually started already a couple days on the road, so it's more immediate, one perception check led to immediate something in the bushes, you're attacked. Adventure.
Yeah, that's even one step further, right?
Yeah.
But you can start with the patron start or with the action start. Yeah, or as Axel.
We could even use the Latin word for it, which is in medias res. Starting directly with the action. Nick, why don't you talk to us a bit more about the patron start before we go on to the action side?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That example is actually fresh in my mind because it's from a video game, from Pathfinder Kingmaker. That's a patron start. If you're familiar with that game, you know that you start your adventure out being at a noble's house, who's asking you to do an expedition of sorts. And there your team is built and you set out into the world. And that is, in my mind, the perfect example of a patron start. Because while at first your characters are all independent from each other, you have a backstory however you like it, there is an outside force creating a bond between the party. And then during the sessions 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 and so on, you can create interpersonal bonds with them. And that it makes for really great role playing because it makes for the party meeting each other for the first time, but there is a reason why they're together, and that eases players into the idea being comfortable with each other. At least that's what I felt.
Yes. So I think just to summarize the concepts we talked about a bit for this, your session 1 is pretty important because it's the first session of the campaign. It's going to set the tone for the whole thing, and it is important to have one motivation for the players at the very least, whether it be intrinsic, which means the players have them. It's a motivation that the players have because of themselves, maybe a personality trait or a family member they want to protect. It's a motivation they've created themselves, but you gotta give them a way to interpret that and a way to put that in the game. Or it can be extrinsic, like with the patron start, where your motivation, your character's motivation, might be something else for themselves, but for the moment they are hired and so must do, that job. And then it's also important to, make it interesting. And I think we were talking about the combat start a bit earlier. And Pat, can you maybe talk to us about why starting directly in the action is good?
Well, it's good because, actually, in that game particularly, we had like one new player. So it's good because it gives everyone something to do. There's immediate crisis. It doesn't have to be combat, but you have to answer somehow. Every character has to do something, unless they're like so apathetic that they, they don't care about their lives or safety or whatever. So it gives, first of all, there's a common danger to everyone. So the party already works as a party because it must, right? You're protecting each other and yourselves in a group. In that particular example, being attacked on the road. I got like a pretty good feedback from my players. They said that they enjoyed just pretty much already being able to use their abilities. It's good because we get to see what the characters can do and who they are right away. And there's already some sort of bond, like I said, after. So if you go to the tavern after the inciting incident or whatever, but you can talk about it. Oh, someone was very hurt, someone was very good in the battle, someone did something interesting. For example, after the battle, it wasn't just about combat. One of the players decided to dissect the creature that attacked them to find out more about it. The players also managed to save some NPCs in combat who they later had some more bond with, instead of just having like an employer-employee bland relationship. Now that employer is actually like owing them their life, he's willing to even pay them more because, I don't know, he's a good guy. He wants to reward good work. I think it's just better than, especially for new players, to have something to do right away. And I actually had like we can talk about it later, but I actually had the being captured prisoner start planned, and I changed it like the day before, and I actually was very happy with it. So
yeah, that's a very good take.
Better.
We can, I think what we can do then is we can finish up talking about this and then present examples of how we each started our campaigns and, what was good about it, what went bad. So, like the inaction start in a way. I have also done that in the past, and one of the reasons I think it's good, and I will expand upon it once we give our examples, is that it creates bonds directly, which means your players have something to care for in the world, and there's this, I guess, psychological effect that happens in D&D, is that the players often project a lot, which means, for example, if they're nice to an NPC, they're more likely to think that NPC is nice as a person because they are projecting their niceness on these people. And starting with this action at the beginning, usually the characters do something heroic, and that means other people will see them as that, and also they will create bonds with other NPCs because they saved them. And so, there'll be relationships created there. So it helps as a plot device almost, because it gives you opportunities for hooks that the players will care about early on in the campaign. But we'll expand on that a bit later. So, Pat, you wanted to talk about how you started and wanted them to be captured and then, switched on to this action scene. Can you describe what happened a bit more in a bit more detail?
Well, I actually asked my players around what they thought, and I got some feedback that they don't necessarily like the captured scenario. So I thought about if I was gonna still do it, but I thought maybe I can come up with something better, and I eventually did, and I thought it was good. I think the captured scenario is in general okay, but you need to do something. And I saw like examples of that. I even played in one game when we were started at level 1 or 2, being captured by like some hobgoblins or whatever. Don't take away freedom from the players. They're captured, but maybe their bonds are really loosely tied. The cage is actually like left open. The guards are sleeping, because if you just have them there, they can't do anything, or the DC is 20 for escaping. It's just shitty. It's just shitty as a player to be in this situation. And this is the beginning of the game. You're setting up this controlling narrative from the perspective of the DM, where they can't do anything. It's so much better, like, let them fight before they can get captured. They don't feel like they've been absolved of their agency. completely. And then if you do that, if you have them like in a room, in a small dungeon, captured by bandits, they can do the reverse dungeon crawl where they're trying to get out of this dungeon. So you have immediate sort of action, but let them do it. Don't wait for the bandit to come over and laugh at them because they're tied down or whatever. Like that's so stupid.
Then we have a really good example of that because Nick, that's exactly how your campaign started.
Yeah, that's why I had to laugh. I did the capture start, and I took Pat's advice without knowing that that's the advice Pat would give. I left the doors to the cages unlocked because their guard was drunk out of his mind and forgot to lock them.
Especially if it's low level. I mean,
exactly.
Right?
The only problem I, as a player, had with the capture start was that it's automatically assumed, even though my character is the one and my character was captured. Which it makes, I don't know, a bit of narrative inconsistency, because immediately as our characters eventually maybe escape from the capturers, they get their weapons and they suddenly easily overpower their capturers. But they somehow were captured by them, which is weird. That's why if I would do a capture start, I would ask my players if they're just okay with being captured, and if they're like, I don't know, then I would do a one-on-one session with each of them, in which we simulate a capturing scene, like maybe a couple of minutes, 10 minutes, to capture each players, to make it more personal or realistic.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, with the unrealistic, like the immersiveness of the world being kind of destroyed if you have characters that easily overpower their captures once they get their weapons back. And to remedy that fact, what my first DM did was actually play 2-on-2 sessions with us and had us poisoned. So we went into a tavern to sign up for like an army type of thing. And instead we met imposters who drugged us and then captured us to sacrifice our characters in some cultist ritual. And easy explanations. You were drugged. You couldn't defend yourself. But once you're clear of mind and have your weapons back, you can fight these people off.
And that's a good way to make sure that your players have agency, because you don't want to set a precedent on session 1 that you will rob players of their agency. You want them to feel like they are in control of what their characters would do, and there's no ludo-narrative dissonance through that. Basically means there's no like difference between the gameplay of them actually fighting and defeating the members of, the bandits or the cultists, and the narrative of them getting captured. It's also a good opportunity to maybe introduce the first bad guy, or the henchman of the bad guy who actually captured them. Is much stronger than them, but then at some point leaves because they've got to do something. They're busy. And so at that point, with that person out there, the players can attempt to escape. That's a good example. And good arguments for it as well. So this is like the capture start. I have an example from my very first campaign, actually, and Nick was, actually you weren't in there. That was like the very, very beginning of my first campaign, when I did an action start. The players were in an amphitheater outside listening to a political discussion because they were a part of this city, or at least had some, involvement in the politics there. And as that was happening, a commercial partner from another city came by, and as he showed the mayor some cool items that they have crafted for him, the whole scene blew up. The mayor teleported away by his bodyguards, and the commercial partner was dead. And at that point, cultists ran into the scene and started just hacking on people. What I liked with that entrance is that players were immediately into it, and players, most of them at least, will want to be heroes. That's why you play in D&D. That's why you're trying to be the good guys. And so when cultists started attacking civilians, you already immediately have a reason to do something. Second thing that was good is that once they did something, once they helped, they already have bonds to the guard because they've been helping them. Maybe there's a couple NPCs they've saved during the battle, and they can be NPCs for later use. And then it sets up the future. why did these cultists come here? Why are they attacking town? You have hooks from there on to continue on the adventure, and the players are invested from the beginning. One thing that didn't work as well is, you gotta make sure the combat is exciting and not boring, doesn't take too long, or it's not like the whole session. You gotta make sure it's an introduction, and then you give the players a bit of time to roleplay, because that's also what session 1 is for, is making sure that the players get a moment to talk to each other, that the characters actually acknowledge each other, and are not just like 4 dudes sitting, cross-armed, one next to another, and just there because of reasons, gotta know each other a little bit. Pavel, how have you started your campaigns in the past? You mentioned a few. Is there like a specific example you'd want to talk about?
Well, the funniest way that I started my campaign is in Curse of Strahd, where the players were captured in the Shadowfell realm.
And we're having some mic issues with you, Pavel.
Oh.
I don't know if you...
Right now, can you hear me?
Yeah.
That's better.
Yeah, it's the position of the mic. The funniest entrance, how I started my campaign, was in Curse of Strahd, where my players were tasked of fighting some werewolves, I think, I remember. Then they went into the mist, and on the other side of the mist, they were in Barovia, and they couldn't turn back. So they were stuck there. Pretty original start, from my opinion, as starts go. Patron start in Tomb of Annihilation. In my homebrew campaign, each player is part of the same city in different factions, and they all work together to improve the city. And they initially had common goals of expanding the city, so they get to know each other, work together, and after they work together for the city, obliged by their factions, then they made relations that became friends, and now they're going to do missions by themselves out of their own volitions, because they make such a good party together. That this campaign started at level 10 or 9, so it was a pretty high level campaign. Yeah, difference. I don't like starting my players captured, even though I'll DM in the future Out of the Abyss, which it starts with the capture scene, and I'll probably DM 1-on-1 how each players, or 2-on-1 how each player was captured, and try to make it as fun as possible.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a perfect segue into the last thing we wanted to talk about, because we've seen many ways of starting a campaign: in a tavern, captured, in media res, or the action start, if you want to call it that, the mercenary start, or the patron start. But there is one thing we need to talk about as well, is before even session 1 happens, 1-on-1 sessions with players, or 2-on-2 sessions with players, to kind of put together the scene before the campaign even begins officially for the party. Does anyone here have experience with doing these kinds of things? Okay, Pavel, you just talked about, so we'll go to you and then Nick.
Okay, I had an experience with an American DM that did like a trial session for free players to join other free players that he already had in an ongoing campaign. And he placed us in the same world, close to the city that the other players were, and we were exploring the zone and meeting each other, traveling to the city, and we were encountering gnolls on our way. Unfortunately, one of our players got booted immediately, because apparently the DM didn't consider him serious enough. He named his character Orc Barbarian Banana Orc, And when he said banana orc rages and charges to battle, he just snapped and kicked it on the
That's
server.
an interesting story.
Yeah. But it felt natural. Like I met the other player. We went together to the city after we escaped from the. No, we weren't captured. We just ran away from the gnolls after we lost our barbarians suddenly to the nether, and we met the other party members next session. It was fun.
Okay, so you have a pretty good experience with that then.
Yeah.
We'll see if that stays the same. Nick, what
Well, I was kind of hesitating to put my hand up because it's not really a session one-on-one session, but you might as well just use it as a one-on-one session, one for newer players. Because what I did was the mirror encounter, where your player character encounters himself in the mirror and has to fight himself, and I used that to show a newer player who never played D&D before how to use his class mechanically in combat, to get him kind of up to speed, Had not that much to do with introducing them into the party per se, but it might still be a good idea to get new players into the habit of playing their character, more like of a show them how it's done rather than tell them approach.
Yeah, so we see, I think through what you guys have been saying, we see the purpose kind of the one-on-one session emerge. It allows you to have contact with the players directly as a DM to, see if they would fit the campaign, though hopefully that is something you've done, before you're playing, but still, it's a good way to still have a bit more information. And it's a good way to familiarize players with either the rules of the game, if they're new players, or just the campaign setting. Just having a 1 hour or 40 minutes one-on-one session where one event happens, it puts the player in the position of the character, where they are now aware of something, an event that happened that the rest of the party didn't live, and as such they can maybe talk about it. They can have, it might be a hook for some role-playing. Or it might be a quest that is presented to them before the campaign even begins. And I feel, at least in my experience, that the players like to have something that is theirs, like almost like secrets. Though secrets in D&D aren't good to have between DMs and players, it's good to have something that the characters can then tell the others that they didn't know about the world. Because that makes their knowledge feel more real, and that makes them more invested in the world itself. Does anyone have anything else to add to the one-on-one session start?
I haven't made any, so I'm wondering, when do you do it? After session 0, when you already know what characters are, then you have, you group them in a way that makes sense, and that's when you do a 2v2, like 2-on-1 or 1-on-1 session. Or, it should probably make sense, right? Or you just have random people with each other.
Yeah.
After the character sheets are built, I feel like anywhere, anytime after the character sheets are built, you can do the 1-on-1 or 2-on-1.
That makes sense.
Okay.
I haven't done one
To
myself
try that.
either, but it seems like a very good way of starting things up. And again, if you want to take examples from media that works very well, campaign 2 of Critical Role, I believe, used the same thing. They had the small sessions, like 2-on-2 sessions, to introduce them. And you can see as through the first episodes, it works really well as they each have things to say to each other. They're not just dropped out of the blue somewhere. They actually have ties to the world that is not things that were seen by the other party members, which I believe is really good.
Were that sessions recorded? I don't think so.
They weren't. Yes,
No, they
they
weren't.
weren't. Yeah.
But maybe it's also good because if you have a little pre-session 1, you get introduced to the game world, and then you meet all the characters on the session where you already know when you're standing. So it's probably good in that way as well.
Exactly, and it makes for role-playing hooks, I believe. All right, well, that's. I think we've talked about the topic in general and mentioned most of the important things, the different starts that you can have that I'm going to recap just for anyone listening that wants to take notes and maybe have different ideas. You could do the typical tavern start, but it has its downsides. You gotta make sure that there's some stimulus, otherwise the players might be just bored out their minds. Or you have experienced players, one of the two. There's the patron start, which is really helpful for that reason, because the players have a reason to be together, and they already have a hook. So in a way, that's a very simple way to start an adventure. Classic, not necessarily the most imaginative in most cases, but that's a perfectly fine option. We have the action start, which is very good for pacing because the players are in the game world immediately and there's stakes. However, it might, not leave the same amount of time for role-playing and knowing each other, though that can be expanded upon in later sessions. We have the capture start, which is in a way the same as a patron start that's disguised. You have a purpose, which is going to be escape. The difficulty in the capture start is going to be the long-term goals of the characters. They have to have their motivations set, because once they escape, there's got to be something that ties them together. And finally, we have one-on-one sessions that you do before the actual session 1, or 2-on-2 sessions, where you take the players and their characters and put them in a situation in the game world before the main events of the story happen. And that's going to be useful for generating plot hooks, role-playing hooks, make players more comfortable and familiar with the game world, and overall I think can add to the experience. So, we've finished the line of topics we wanted to talk about for today, and I think we're pretty good in terms of timing. We talked about session 0, and we talked about how to start your campaign. And we don't know what we're going to talk about next time just yet, I believe, unless someone has any ideas, but that's,
Probably something D&D related.
Probably something.
down.
Very well, that's a good observation. Yeah. But, yes, please, if you're seeing this on YouTube or on Buzzsprout, please like the video. If you're on YouTube, please leave a comment, give us feedback, or give us things you'd like us to talk about. And if you want to see more of these videos in the future, don't hesitate to subscribe. It's free, and you can always unsubscribe if you don't want to see our content. Thanks to everyone for watching and listening in on us rambling about stuff. Hopefully there are a few gems in there and a few pieces of information that you can take away for your own game. And hopefully we learn as well. That's kind of the goal here. So thank you to everyone. And this was Cardinal Directions. And we'll see you next time.